Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film It's a Big Country from 1951. Now, this is continuing my quest to review all of the films directed by William A. Wellman, and this is not actually just a Wellman film. This is an anthology film. It's directed by about 8 directors. It has 8 different segments. He just directed one of the segments, but because I'm a completionist when it comes to my William Wellman series, I decided to review It's a Big Country as well. This is very much a part of the Dory Sherry reign of MGM. It was actually in production for a while, and it was an anthology film to remind people how wonderful and amazing the melting pot of America was in the 1950s. Now, the whole idea of it is its biggest problem, because you're watching a film that has all these segments that are basically like, hooray for America, but it just kind of comes off as propaganda. I'm not a negative America person, I'm not solely positive America person, but there's no way to really enjoy this film with your brain turned on. None of these segments are really compelling and make you think about how wonderful America is. It just makes you think how boring it is when people preach to you and push the message of anything towards you as much as this film's doing, just to remind people that despite communism and the Korean War and the Cold War starting and segregation and all these other issues, that America was really great. And aw shucks, we should just ignore all that stuff and talk about how great America is, brushing it all under the table and making kind of really safe kind of Hollywood entertainment that you expect from the cliche of Hollywood in the 50s. It's like the film that people who have no idea about history and such would watch this and go, see, things were simple and things were great. But at the time, people hated this movie. Critics didn't like it. It didn't do well. I don't see, honestly, why it would, because it's not really enjoyable. It was hard to stay awake. I had to rewind a couple segments because of that. I have seen the entire movie. Like a lot of anthology films, it does not have a great flow whatsoever. It's just various segments from various different parts of America. Some are more specific parts. Others are just like, you know, this happened in America, so America's great. What's the big deal? It is actually kind of obscure. It never gets played. Even when TCM played it, I DVR'd it from, I think, the summer or the fall when Janet Leigh was the star of the month, and Robert Osborne even said it's rarely shown, and I can kind of see why. It'd be fun to see on 4th of July, like I like to do with anthology films. I'm going to go through every segment because it's kind of hard to talk about an anthology film without doing so. I do have to kind of give credit to this blog for helping me find out who directed each segment. Without it, I would have no clue which segment William Wellman directed. This blog, Immortal Emphyria, I think, and it was written by Cliff L. Peretti. I'm going to have a link in the description, but he really deserves credit because it was taking me forever to find out which director directed which segment, and he even has the names of each of the segments, which I, through other research, found out that is correct. So let's go through these. The first one is Interruptions. Interruptions is directed by Richard Thorpe. Maybe getting that right or wrong. It stars James Whitmore and William Powell, and they're in New York in a very nice train, and he's talking about how great America is, and then William Powell's like, well, which America do you mean? This America or that America? It's a cute, dumb little sitcom-y segment, and it really starts you off thinking about how much I don't like this movie at all. Puts you off on the wrong foot. It gives you a terrible smell of bullshit that is the rest of this movie. It has a cute little ending, but it's not great. The next segment is called The Lady and the Census Taker, which was a terrible name for a band, but it is directed by John Sturges. It is about a woman played by Ethel Barrymore that goes to the newspaper when she finds out she was not counted for the census and is all upset that she lives far away from everyone and doesn't live near her family and doesn't have neighbors close to her, and how she's like 75. And then you start to wonder, maybe she should like be in a retirement home where someone can take care of her, because what if she falls or something? But they don't get into that. But they go through all this trouble of finding her a census person to finally count her as part of the census. She really puts a lot of emphasis on being counted for the census, because this could be like her last census. To be honest, I think there's been a couple of censuses I wasn't counted for. Not because like I didn't want to be. I don't remember them coming to my door doing that. So I think the last one I wasn't counted for. So I didn't really get that upset about it. I did feel a little left out. I would have liked to have been counted for the census. So I guess I get where she's coming from. They have like a lot of emphasis on it, which is a little silly because it's not like the census is like the most amazing thing in the world. But Ethel Barrymore does a pretty good job. Keenan Wynn, I kind of liked in here. It's a lot of aw shucksness that this movie continued to annoy me in its American propaganda-ness. It's like, no, the census is important. It's America's head count. How can you not think a head count is important? Didn't you see the beginning of Home Alone? Next segment is probably the most offensive segment, and that's the one that is actually called the Negro Story. It is literally just a part where they kind of just tell you about famous black people in America and just have film clips and newsreel clips and have the narrator who narrates between segments giving this some sort of cohesion. Lewis Calhern, he talks over this entire segment and just goes like, look, America has great black people. What's the big deal? We're not racist, even though we segregated this segment away from everything else and didn't have any other nationalities that weren't white people in this entire movie. Even at the time that this film was released, people criticized it, saying it was segregated from the rest of the movie. It very much is. It's not a very good segment. I don't understand why it is in here other than to be like, we're not racist, even though it screams out like, wow, you're really worried about being racist by doing something incredibly racist. This decision was horrible, and it also doesn't work because how come the entire rest of the movie are filmed by various directors and then this is just like kind of a newsreel documentary thing? It just doesn't work. It doesn't flow with the rest of the movie. It really takes you out of it, regardless of the race issue. It just does not really work within the entire movie, and it's just kind of awful. It doesn't remind you of how great America is. It reminds you of how at the time, how kind of racist and segregated it still was in 1951. The next segment is Rosca the Rose, which is directed by Charles Vidor. It's about a Hungarian father who has like a lot of daughters, but not a wife, probably because she died giving birth to lots of daughters. And then his one daughter, Janet Leigh, falls in love with a non-Hungarian played by Gene Kelly, who is Greek. It kind of just gets into how America is a melting pot and we have Hungarians and Greeks, even though these Hungarians hate Greeks for like no reason. Gene Kelly's actually kind of good, even though you can tell he's like gritting his teeth because he knows this is like a terrible movie, but he kind of elevates Janet Leigh's performance a little bit. He kind of like dominates this whole segment. It's a dumb segment, although I will give it credit for having a scene where the dad's gathering up all his daughters to stop his daughter from falling in love with this Greek guy because she's a stenographer at an ice cream shop. I don't really understand that. No one who reviewed it seems to understand that. Who had a stenographer in an ice cream shop? Like, what was she writing down people's conversations so they could blackmail them later? Oh my god, that's so much of a better movie. Why didn't they do that? But that wasn't what it was. She's just a stenographer. You don't even find out what she's stenographing. You just find out that she falls in love with Gene Kelly, which Gene Kelly's like so good in this. His name is actually Icarus Xenophon. This segment is not really great. It's the most sitcom-y, but there is a segment where the father's gathering up all the daughters. It's kind of like a silent film comedy. They kind of have funny music and nobody speaks because they're all hollering at each other. It's just kind of like a car horn. I thought that was actually probably one of my favorite parts of the whole movie, but the rest of it is just kind of like a dumb 50s sitcom, kind of aw shucksy, Leave It to Beaver type of thing, and it ages about as well as that sounds. So the next segment is Letter from Korea, directed by Don Weiss. A lot of people act like Margarine Main, who I do think gives a good performance in this, and she's confronted with who her son served with in Korea and he was killed, and it's this actor named Keith Barrisell, I think. I agree Margarine Main does give a pretty decent performance, but I don't think she gives enough of a performance to elevate the kind of hamminess of this segment. I really didn't like this segment, and maybe I would have liked it if I hadn't been beaten down by the previous 4 segments, which I don't think helped this one, but it's overly serious. I understand why it's overly serious, and apparently it has a bit about kind of anti-Semitism in it because she doesn't believe him that he was with her son, even though, like, why would he show up at your house? It kind of slowed down the movie. It was the segment I fell asleep during. I did think Margarine Main tried to bring some earnestness to a film that kind of didn't know what to do with it. It kind of didn't work, but it was kind of good on her for kind of trying. So the next segment in this film is called Texas. It was directed by Clarence Brown, and it is honestly my favorite part of the movie. It stars Gary Cooper, is just a guy talking about Texas and how great Texas is. It's a 3-minute thing. If someone could take that clip and put it on YouTube, I would be greatly appreciated. If it is, I will link it in here, but as of the moment I'm shooting this, it was not. But it is a great segment with Gary Cooper just talking talking about Texas, and it was the most fun. It's the one that kind of got what it was doing and actually was a little silly and had fun with itself. If the rest of the film was just a funny thing with an actor talking about the state they were from or whatever and having fun with it, this would have been an enjoyable, fun, silly little thing. And Texas got that and brought some much needed life and fun to this movie. It was dumb fun, and it was like the only joy that came out of this movie and the only thing that's worth seeing within this movie. And I thought Gary Cooper did a good job. I was hoping Wellman directed this segment. He did not. It would have been a nice Gary Cooper Wellman reunion from, of course, Wings, but that didn't happen. Wellman directed the next segment. Now, the next segment is called Minister in Washington, and it is directed by William A. Wellman. It is very much reminiscent of the kind of studio pictures that Wellman was being assigned within the 50s and 40s, and it showed the kind of direction you expect from that kind of time period from him. It stars Van Johnson, who is a reverend who has been called to be the minister at FDR's church. Why it kind of went back in time all of a sudden, it doesn't really explain, and then he starts preaching mainly to the president and then decides he shouldn't do that, and then FDR wants to meet him, and you don't see that segment. It doesn't really have an ending. It isn't really very good, and it doesn't show Wellman at his best. I kind of only saw this movie for the Wellman segment, and it was really disappointing. Wellman actually did another favor for Dory Sherry for doing The Next Voice You Hear. This is another one. Wellman really didn't like working for MGM, and I imagine like doing two favors in a row for Dory Sherry did not help that relationship, even though he had a lot to do with getting Mayer out of there and Dory Sherry in, and a major regime change to happen when he made Battleground, and they kind of thank him by making him do shit like this. It isn't very Wellman. It isn't very good. I noticed a lot of these segments are done with a lot of long shots, which made me think they didn't even want to have to deal with working on how it was going to be edited. They're like, let's just do this as quickly as possible, and Wellman's definitely felt like that. I did notice it has a bit more shadows in his segment, but I think I'm just trying to make the best of it, and it just really wasn't very good. It's probably one of my more least favorite things I've seen Wellman ever do. Alright, now to the final segment, Four Eyes, directed by Dan Hartman. This is supposed to give it more of a punch at the end, but it's just awful. Frederick March stars as this father, is Italian, and he's a patriarch in his family, and he doesn't want his son to have glasses, even though his son needs glasses, and guess what? His son gets glasses. It's the whole thing. It wasn't very good. It was extremely sitcom-y. It was more sitcom-y than the rest of them, and it was actually more boring than the previous sitcom-y segment with Gene Kelly. This one is just not very good and boring, and Nancy Reagan's in it. Or she was Nancy Davis then. There was going to be a segment directed by Anthony Mann that actually got cut. There was going to be a segment that dealt with African Americans in baseball. That didn't happen. There was a segment that was supposed to be with a Chinese American family they deemed too offensive as well. And apparently this film was mercifully cut down from what I've read. Wow, I can't imagine this being any longer. It is pretty awful, and I don't really understand why they made it other than having Dory Sherry's more liberal focused ideas, and it really feels like his kind of a thing. The thing with this film is it's so micromanaged from a studio level. None of these directors could really have any fun with it except for like the Texas segment. The 50s were an interesting time in Hollywood because a lot of actors were going independent and doing more kind of independent films, leaving the studio behind, and there weren't as many stars signed to a certain studio anymore. And this is kind of like, if you're going to make them do crap like this, I can kind of understand why they wouldn't want to be involved in a studio anymore. If this had been done in the 30s, it probably would have been a lot more fun, but the 50s did feel a lot more constrained. The whole idea of it doesn't really work, and how kind of cheap, and how none of these directors seem to really want to be there. And as for Wellman, I kind of understand why he didn't want to be with MGM and then went with Rat Jack after this, and I totally get it, because between this and My Man and I and The Next Voice You Hear, you kind of understand where he was coming from. He did favors for them, and they wouldn't promote West for the Women like they should have. When you look at It's a Big Country, it kind of shows the negative sides of the Hollywood studio filmmaking at a time when people were looking at that and looking at a way out, and boy did this give it to them in a way that the studio wouldn't admit to its wrongdoing. It kind of just acted like this was a good idea, and that was a good enough of an idea for everyone else to kind of just not sign to studio contracts anymore. And frankly, it doesn't make me want to really watch another 50s Hollywood film like right after. It puts a bad taste in your mouth. Puts a bad taste in your mouth for a country that they would have such an ego about your own stupid country to make crap like this. So if you have seen It's a Big Country and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.